The premise of this entire project really came about after I started thinking more about how our goals as a Basque Connections group this year has been to more deeply examine the ways that preaching can address topics of immigration and the concept of the stranger. But in looking at past sermons preached in the chapel, very few actually came from a person with lived immigration experience, which then made me wonder about how the pulpit itself can be an othering space. And if there are already limitations and obstacles to what kinds of bodies have been historically invited into our pulpit, then maybe it's worth also looking at the limitations we place on what a sermon actually can be. And so perhaps they're way beyond the 20 to 30-minute speech, I guess, to capture and hold the hope, lament, anger, tension, and all the feelings in between that come with immigration. And in order to hold these stories and preach these stories well, perhaps it's beneficial or necessary even to turn towards an alternative or quote unquote non-traditional way of preaching. And so to explore this non-traditional preaching a little bit more, I wanted to see what it would be like to reimagine an existing sermon from the archives. And for this project, the sermon that I chose was called No Longer Strangers and Sojourners by Harry W. Gilmer. And for what I'll consider to be non-traditional preaching, I want to look at these poems by 4 different authors and essentially use them to respond to various quotes within Gilmer's sermon. And I chose to focus on poetry because there's already a strong tie to traditional preaching because of its use of words, but there's also a degree of open-endedness and vulnerability required for poetry in order for it to subsist as a form of art. And so the first line in Gilmer's sermon is this: the first time you leave your native territory to go off to a foreign place, you may have come to the sudden realization that not only is it a strange place, but not a single soul knows you. And for Gilmer, this experience was moving from Tennessee to Atlanta, which isn't to say that his experiences aren't valid, right? But it's important to acknowledge that Gilmer's experience of being a stranger already can't be compared to the experience of immigration. Because for so many, the experience of strangeness and being the stranger is not only not temporary, but also carried through generations, which is why I want to first consider this poem by Muna Abdullahi. And the poem begins with, my daughter, I pray to God every day you don't understand what it's like to be me. And after describing everything that her parents endure to basically ensure a future for their child, the poem ends with, my daughter, I did not bring you here to be anything like me. She later goes on to describe how she's considered first generation because the American dream was never meant for her parents, it was always meant for her. And I think there's an incredible tension here because by embodying the perspective of her parents, she's also embodying their pain. And it's ironic that humans yearn to be known, but her parents are so ready to bear the burden of being constantly inaccurately perceived just so that their daughter is seen and heard. So I think this goes beyond just feeling like a stranger, right? It's balancing both lament and faith in the face of strangeness, and also the hope that it brings new beginnings. And so in Gilmer's sermon, he then goes on to discuss a deep longing for community and belonging, which I think is a pretty universal statement, right? Our response to like experiencing being a stranger is to find places to belong. But I think the question to be asked here in response to it is, what does it mean to be included? Because I'm pretty sure Gilmer's experience of longing for inclusion and what inclusion looks like for him is completely different than someone like Shirley Wolpe. And in her poem, Dear America, Wolpe describes her dreaming and longing to be in America, saying that she loved America more than bubblegum, and saying, I dreamed of you, America. I dreamed of you every single night with the ferocity of a lost child until you became true like flesh. And when I arrived at you, you punched yourself into me like a laugh. Perhaps this is a more explicit expression of longing for belonging, right? An example of what wanting to be included actually looks like in a person, because for her, especially, inclusion isn't just simply arriving at America. In this poem, the shiny hope of belonging, right, is juxtaposed with a quite frankly painful reality of what America actually was like for her. So when we preach about not wanting to be an outsider, it seems like Gilmer approaches this by focusing on the benefits of community, right, and the warmth of inclusion that it offers. But Opie addresses the harm of that comes from being intentionally excluded from a place you thought would be welcoming. And so later on, Gilmer continues his discussion of longing by saying that it's essentially a desire to be at one with the one who is the creator. And he also makes a point to call out the fact that we often say, you are all one in Christ Jesus, yet they seldom seem true in the concrete situations of life. And so it's here that Gilmer goes into talking about inclusionist versus exclusionist principles, in which the exclusionist principle is essentially motivated by fear and defensiveness. And so we form communities that basically exist so we can separate ourselves from others. And this is also where he calls his congregation into inclusionist principles, because the inclusionist, to use his words, moves towards wholeness. I think the main weakness in Gilmer's sermon here is the lack of concrete details. Because when I first listened to the sermon, I found myself asking, okay, yes, and question mark, because this question, I mean, the sentence really is an empty platitude, right, if not followed by tangible actions. So I wanted to consider the poem Prayer for My Immigrant Relatives, in which the author prays over her relatives who are leaving their homes for a new one. Help them to recall, help them to hear, she prays. Remind them of the phone call back home saying we arrived, yeah, we made it here. And what stands out to me here is the story of the in-between. Her relatives are not yet at the new place, but also what they consider to be home is long behind them, right? So here we hold fear and we hold hope together, and we are explicitly reminded that stories of immigration don't exist as a binary, right? There's not a from there to here, or from here to there. I think what's most interesting, though, is the fact that even though she doesn't say explicitly, this prayer is an argument for inclusion. Because if we actually embodied the inclusionist principles that Gilmer is evidently pushing his congregation towards, perhaps this prayer would look entirely different. In fact, perhaps this prayer wouldn't exist, because the fact that she's praying this is a testament to how the statement, you are all one in Christ Jesus, continues to be an empty one for so many people. And lastly, Gilmer ends his sermon with this sentence: may God here so unite us to himself that we shall be united each to the other, no longer strangers and sojourners. I think the major advantage here, and I use that word lightly, is that Gilmer can use his pulpit to directly communicate a vision for the future. And the takeaway here for the congregation is pretty clear. But in a similar way, Lee Young Lee's poem, I Asked My Mother to Sing, I think expresses the same vision that Gilmer communicated, even though it's slightly less direct. The context is set in the beginning when Lee writes, she begins, and my grandmother joins her. Mother and daughter sing like young girls. And though he can't recall or relate to the things that his mother and grandmother are singing of, such as going to the summer palace or the stone boat, he says that he loves to hear it sung, how the water lilies fill with rain until they overturn, spilling water into water, then rock back and fill with more. Both women have begun to cry, but neither stops her song. When we talk about the stranger, I think maybe we forget to consider everything that they've left behind. That when people enter and seek new communities, right, they're also bringing years of personal history and tradition. And so if a community seeks to be inclusive, maybe it needs to do a better job of holding both the past and the present. And if the church seeks to be the inclusive community that Gilmer seems to be talking about, maybe it just needs to do a better job of inviting others to sing. So to take a step back, I tried selecting quotes from Gilmer's sermon that represented the more linear logic that's often crucial for a traditional sermon. So he goes from introducing the feelings of being a stranger to longing to be included and then for community, and then finally addressing his congregation and having that invitation there to essentially adopt a posture that seeks to embrace other people. And so in considering the poems or non-traditional preaching, I think there's first and foremost a much stronger reliance on personal narratives. And within these narratives, there are additional nuances that should be considered and I think are beneficial when talking about immigration communities and belonging, but can never really be fully addressed by someone like Gilmer and the sermon that he preaches. And so when considering poetry as a form of preaching, I think it is possible to stay true to the essence of the sermon that Gilmer originally intended, but also have that create space for more nuances and questions. And I think it's within these gray areas that we can actually address the topic of immigration and the concept of the stranger um, within the context of this decade and the problems and the questions that we're asking now. I mean, admittedly, there are flaws with this way of envisioning and portraying a sermon, right? So first, there's no mention of specific biblical texts. And also, I know that by just choosing 4 poems, I'm not able to completely represent the entirety of Gilmer's sermon. So this kind of exists as just fragments of a larger sermon, as well as fragments of different narratives and different stories. But yeah, my hope here is to address the possibility of seeing something that we wouldn't normally consider sermonic as an actual sermon, right? So there can be invitations to further questioning and further conversations that maybe Gilmer's traditional sermon doesn't quite convey. And maybe we can go beyond a singular truth or message because there are multiple interpretations that can be had and held, right? And I think with that, there's more beauty there and than just a singular message that's communicated as one singular truth. So when we go beyond traditional preaching, we're also able to reimagine the pulpit as a space. Maybe get rid of it entirely, right? Maybe you don't have to physically be inside a pulpit to preach a message that's worth listening to. And finally, I think it's much easier to include narratives that come directly from the source when you look at non-traditional preaching, and especially because it's one thing to tell the stories of others when preaching, and there's a lot to be said about how to do that well, right? But if we view stories or sermons as a fruit that we would consume, it's also probably best to go directly to the tree. This isn't to say, right, that Gilmer's sermon wasn't good for his congregation at his time, but I think in the context of what we want to wrestle with in regards to immigration in our current context, I think there's always room to challenge and expand. And I think, and I hope that considering new forms for sermons is a way that we can do so. So yeah, these are pictures of the 4 authors whose poems I used today. I think identity isn't just in a name, but also in a face. So hopefully that's helpful when considering their stories. But yeah, thank you.